Jeremy rolled over in bed and glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 5:55 stared back at him in red LED numbers. A tiny red dot was lit next to the AM designation. Not even 6 o'clock yet, he thought sluggishly. Still too early to get up. But the anticipation that he harbored for Christmas morning was severely tempered by the memory of what he had witnessed earlier that same night, or thought he had witnessed. It was shortly after 2:30 am when he woke up, as most children do, overwhelmed by the curiosity of what lay under the Christmas tree, with excitement that could only be fostered in a child on that most anticipated of nights. He gleefully crawled out of bed and tiptoed down the stairs to investigate whether or not jolly old Saint Nick had fulfilled his holiday duties. The Christmas tree in red, green and blue illuminated the room. Jeremy's father didn't like leaving lights on at night, but made an exception on Christmas Eve. Making his way through the room, Jeremy kept his eyes on his destination, the Christmas tree, or more accurately, the presents underneath it. He was fearful of breaking his parents' rule about not looking at them before morning, but his curiosity got the better of him. He paused briefly, taking in the beautiful sight of the room before locking his still groggy eyes on the Christmas tree, which loomed directly in front of him in the far corner of the room. It stood there, silently guarding the brightly wrapped treasures beneath it, daring anyone to unwrap them before the morning. It was large, nearly 8 feet tall, and was packed with such an assortment of ornaments and tinsel that nearly no green was visible on it at all. Since Jeremy was an only child, he knew that virtually all of the gifts were for him, a thought that increased his excitement tenfold. It was one of the many perks of not having any brothers or sisters. Jeremy's heart raced in his chest as he approached the neatly stacked gifts under the tree. He immediately focused on 2 of the larger ones, wrapped in bright red and blue striped wrapping paper respectively, and slid closer to them for a better look. As he reached for the larger one, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Something on the tree shifted. Jeremy looked up from his gifts and watched for any more movement. After a few tense minutes, he was satisfied he had imagined it, and he continued examining his future prizes. But a small part of his mind wouldn't let go of the movement. It tried to rationalize it, but failed to attach any plausible explanation. A mouse in the tree, a loose branch, a faulty light strand. Possibly, but unlikely. Jeremy looked at the tree again. It was beautiful, fully lit with shimmering ornaments and dazzling tinsel. But there was something else as well, something he couldn't explain, but felt nonetheless. The angel fastened to the top of the tree gazed solemnly across the room. Her flowing garb of gold and blue obscured most of her body, trailing down to mingle with the other decorations. She was the crowning glory of the tree, standing guard year after year from her lofty holiday perch. Jeremy looked up at her, momentarily forgetting about the presents. He recognized the look in her tiny glass eyes. Even though they weren't real, they still conveyed the Christmas spirit. But they also seemed different somehow, more detached from Christmas and less concerned with holiday cheer. Jeremy's gaze fell upon the presents again. He huddled up close to them, periodically inspecting each and every one as he glanced back at the stairway. And then he noticed it again. There was movement in the tree, only this time it was more pronounced, and in a different area closer to the top. Now he was getting nervous. He still wasn't sure if he were imagining it or not, but the uneasy feeling that was settling over the room was unmistakable. He scooted away from the presents and stood up, all the while never taking his eyes off the tree. Slowly turning around, his only thought was getting back to the safety of his bedroom. In the morning, with the added security of his parents and daylight, he could truly enjoy the holiday and tear into his presents. He resisted the urge to look back as he scurried toward the stairs. He was afraid that he might see something he would regret seeing, possibly for the rest of his life. Within 30 seconds, he was tucked safely under his covers, trying desperately to fall back asleep. Jeremy glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 6:17 a.m., still too early to get up. Not that he really wanted to get out of bed, but the thought that eventually his parents would come into his room and make him wake up frightened him. They would no doubt be curious as to why their little boy wasn't awake yet on Christmas morning. He would then be obligated to go downstairs with them and open his presents, the ones under the Christmas tree. Jeremy looked over at the clock again, somehow hoping that time had moved backward. 6:24 a.m., still too early. "Good morning, big guy," Jeremy's dad bellowed as he flipped on the light switch. "Don't you want to see what Santa brought this year?" He was gesturing towards the hallway. His mother was standing behind him, beaming from ear to ear, a red and green coffee mug in her hands. Jeremy smiled as best he could and slowly crawled out of bed. Part of him was excited, but another part was scared to death. The tree outside a nearby window laid on its side, mostly covered by freshly fallen snow, its pine needles lying on the frozen ground beneath it. It had been discarded carelessly, tossed aside like yesterday's trash. The Christmas tree shuddered with anxious excitement when it heard the approaching footsteps in the hallway upstairs. It adjusted the angel at its top slightly, one of its many hunting tactics, and waited. We shuffled out of the alley, took a right turn, and bore down slowly upon a Vonley care home for elderly zombies. When we reached the cast iron gates, my father buzzed the intercom to gain access, and they swung open ponderously in front of us. My father made to step inside the grounds, but I held back, suddenly fearful and not so keen to see my grandfather any longer. "Come on, Callum," my father urged. "It'll be fine, really." I still hung back, not particularly convinced. The care home was nothing like I imagined it would be. Thin grass speckled the vast grounds, and here and there, dotted about mostly in areas closer to the cracked pathway, the odd flower grew, sometimes even in bunches of 5 or 6. A single tree stood a short distance from the gate, and not only did it look alive and healthy, but my eyes caught movement high up of a squirrel darting between the branches. No, of 2 squirrels racing each other to the tree's crown. Of 3 or 4, a bird burst from out of the upper foliage. "Come on." I tore my eyes from the flying bird and glanced again into the grounds. It was all just so unnatural. My father held out a hand, and I darted towards it, anxious for the touch of something I could depend on, something safe. Even the smell here was all wrong. The reassuring reek of death I associated with the safe havens of home, friends' houses, and even school, was in this place only a mild stench. "That's it," comforted my father. "We'll just make it a quick visit. We won't be long, I promise." I nodded and bound my arms even more tightly around his own, wishing that he had yielded to my mother's protestations, that I should remain at home with her after all. But my father was adamant that I should come. Dementia eventually claimed all the males in his family, he told her, and he insisted I catch a glimpse of what would be my future, so that I remembered always never to waste a moment of my present. I felt as if I had already seen enough. My father escorted me slowly up the path, and as we got closer to the huge grey cube that was the care home, I saw a number of elderly zombies shuffling about or sitting on benches. Something wasn't quite right about them, although I couldn't put my finger on what this was, but in a strange way I found their presence oddly reassuring. I suppose it was because, old, decrepit, and falling apart as they might have been, they were at least zombies and hadn't been transformed by their stay into some kinds of unimaginable monsters. A nurse met us inside the door, clothed in a white uniform stained brown with old blood. Her body was twisted to the right, so that she walked with a limp, and she smiled at me, a beaming, gap-toothed smile. It was comforting to come across somebody in the middle of this place who was obviously still invested with some sort of normal zombinity, and I smiled back, shyly accepting the sweet she pulled out of a pocket for me. A new hippocampus and spleen variety, she told me. And just wait till you get to the soft center. You're here to see Mr. Wainwright, I assume. I popped the sweet in my mouth while she and my father discussed my grandfather further. Hippocampus had always been my favorite flavor sweet, and the delicious tang of spleen combined to give it an exotic, heavenly taste beyond anything I had ever tasted before, until I bit through the crunchy exterior. Then my taste buds fizzed quite literally, and I couldn't stop myself crying out in pleasure. The nurse gave me another smile. Thyroid, but one enhanced by Gorgia. Told you it would be good. She turned back to my father. Do you want me to show you the way, or will you be all right on your own? We'll be fine, my father told her. I can remember the way. We shambled off through drab, freshly painted corridors towards whichever room was my grandfather's. The atmosphere was all wrong still, and, if anything, the mild stench had deteriorated further to a pungent smell, but with the taste of the sweet still exploding around the inside of my mouth. These were facts I was only dimly aware of. And then we were waiting outside my grandfather's room. My father bent down to look me in the eye, his expression suddenly more serious than I ever remembered having seen it before. Now, Callum, he began, I want you to know that your grandfather is worse than I realized. He took another turn yesterday morning, and the nurse tells me he's pretty bad, so I need you to be brave. He might look different, he might act different, and he might not even remember who you are or who I am. But remember, whatever you see, he is your grandfather. Okay. I nodded mechanically, suddenly fearful again. Then my father opened the door and we stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. There was no hint of death here, only the scent of flowers, tulips, I later found out. The room was well lit, tidy, and every surface looked spotlessly clean. It was as if I had walked into an alien world. But all this was nothing compared to the change I saw in my grandfather. He too was spotlessly clean. His clothes, a grey suit with white shirt and blue tie, were carefully ironed. His hair was neatly combed, and his skin had lost much of its greyness and was a scary shade of pale pink. He was sat at a table with a deck of cards spread across its surface, and opposite him sat a man, a human man. Dad, exclaimed my father, what the hell are you doing? The human jumped up quickly, backing into the fireplace, his face quickly turning a healthier-looking shade of grey. My grandfather, on the other hand, simply looked confused. I'm sorry, he mumbled. Dad? Who? Your son, answered my father. Ray, and this is your grandson, Callum. My grandfather peered at me. Son, grandson, I'm sorry. He looked so confused, sounded so pitiful that, despite his condition, my heart went out to him, and I felt as if I wanted to cry. My father, however, had flown into a rare rage. Yes, son, Dad. Can't. I mean, they said you were bad and not eating, but honestly, playing with your food like this. Never thought. Look. He strode haltingly across the room towards the cowering human, who was trying unsuccessfully to retreat into the small space of the fireplace. This isn't a toy. It's food. My father grabbed the human round the throat, held him up in the air, and forced him against the wall with one hand. His other hand punched its way through the man's stomach and emerged again with a handful of intestines. See, food. He turned, slammed the dying human onto the table, and thrust the entrails at my grandfather. My grandfather looked at them with a dazed expression, then up at my father and back to the human man. Then his face paled to grey, and with a gargled yell, he launched himself up at my father, his son, and clapped a hand around his throat. I screamed and dived at the both of them, begging and pleading with them to stop. Then orderlies in white coats were rushing past me. I was flung into a wall, and the next thing I knew, my father was escorting me from the room, the skin on his right cheek, torn and hanging low. That was the last time I saw my grandfather undying, and I never did forget it. Yes, officer, I admit I hit Mr. Whitmore. I hit him right on the head with the silver chandelier I inherited from my mother. No, of course I didn't want to kill him. That was an unfortunate accident, and I'm very sorry. Poor Mrs. Whitmore. But what was I supposed to do? He broke into my apartment and wanted to take Miles away from me. Who is Miles? Well, Miles is my cat, a 10-year-old white Persian with marvelous blue eyes. A friend gave him to me soon after my husband passed away. He was just a kitten then, and I must say that taking care of him was the only thing that kept me alive during those difficult times. Yes, it was like I said. Mr. Whitmore wanted to take Miles away, and that's why I hit him with the chandelier. I couldn't allow him to take Miles away, could I? I'm an old woman, officer, and Miles is my only friend. Well, I can't say why Mr. Whitmore wanted to do that. Who can say what was going on the poor man's mind? Besides, I don't think we should say bad things about the dead. It's just not right, don't you agree? Yes, officer, I understand you need to know what really happened. But even so, I don't think. Very well then. Since you're insisting so much, I will tell you this. I can't say for sure what Mr. Whitmore would do with Miles if he had taken him from me, but I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't see Miles again. Why do I say that? Because Mr. Whitmore hated Miles. He always did. No, I don't know why. I mean, I can understand when somebody says he prefers a dog instead of a cat, because that's a matter of personal preference, and although I think a cat is worth a dozen dogs, I can understand it. But that was not the case with Mr. Whitmore. It was not that he wasn't a cat person, he really disliked Miles. Previous incidents? Well, I wouldn't call them incidents, but yes, there had been some awkward situations before. Since Miles was a kitten, Mr. Whitmore had always complained about him. He blamed Miles for everything wrong that happened. I remember once when he found a dead rat at his front door and insisted it had been Miles who had put it there. Nonsense. It could have been any cat, but he was sure it had been Miles. He was so angry then that I became worried he would have a stroke. His whole face turned red. He even yelled at me. I also remember another time. Sure, officer, let's focus on these last weeks. I apologize for wandering so much, but my mind just isn't what it used to be anymore. It's the age, you know. The brain cells start dying. I know because I watched a TV show about it on Discovery Channel, and they explained it all. But here I go again. I'm sorry. You wanted to know about these last weeks, is that it? Any recent incident? Well, now that you mentioned it, yes, there has been one. Mr. Whitmore complained of a bad smell. He said he could feel it from inside his apartment, and of course he blamed Miles for it. When? Let's see. I think it was about 10 days ago. What did I do? Well, nothing. I just ignored him, as I always do. What else shall I do? I know that Miles smells a little, but I don't care. He is my friend, right? Besides, it was none of Mr. Whitmore's business. What happened then? Well, as the days passed by, Mr. Whitmore didn't let it go. Instead, he complained more and more. He said that the stench was getting worse, and that he could smell it coming from my apartment. He said it was unbearable, and he was sure it was coming from Miles. He said that if I didn't get rid of the stench, he would do it himself. When was that? Do you mean the exact date? I think it was 2 days ago. Yes, that was the last time I saw him before this morning, when he broke into my apartment. What happened? It was very awkward. I heard a knock at the door, and I opened it. Then Mr. Whitmore just pushed me aside and entered into my apartment. The man seemed possessed. No, he didn't say anything, but I knew he was there to take Miles away. I could see it in his eyes. That's why I took the chandelier and hit him. I couldn't allow that. I couldn't let him take Miles away from me. Miles is my best friend, my only friend. Couldn't Mr. Whitmore understand that? I don't have anyone else in the world but Miles. He is my cat, and I love him. What if he threw a dead rat on the man's door? I don't care. What if he smells bad? I don't care either. And I bet Mr. Whitmore would smell much worse than Miles if he also had been dead for 2 weeks.